Most people aren't stuck because life is hard. They're stuck because they refuse to let go of the things silently destroying their potential. Today, I'm going to show you why the version of you that's holding on is the version that's holding you back. Radical self-honesty begins with acknowledging the quiet truths you've been avoiding, the ones that whisper when the world gets silent and distractions fade. And it demands the courage to stop pretending that comfort equals happiness, because comfort often hides the things slowly draining your potential. And when you finally face the reality of what isn't working, you strip away the excuses that keep you trapped in cycles you've outgrown. And this kind of honesty isn't gentle, it's confrontational, direct, and sometimes painfully inconvenient, yet it's the only way to disrupt stagnation. And you start seeing the difference between what you want to believe and what your results are actually showing you every single day. And self-honesty forces you to admit that some habits exist only because they're easy, not because they're meaningful or aligned with who you want to become. And it reveals the people you keep around out of familiarity rather than genuine connection, growth, or shared values that elevate you. And it exposes the stories you tell yourself to justify staying small, even though a bigger life is quietly knocking from the outside. And through this honesty, you finally recognize that holding on is often the real risk, not letting go of what no longer serves you. And once you see your truth clearly, you can no longer tolerate the versions of yourself built on fear, avoidance, or outdated expectations. And radical self-honesty requires stripping away every layer of identity you've built to impress, protect, or hide behind, exposing your most unfiltered self. And it means admitting when you're living below your potential and owning the moments where you allowed comfort to override your ambition. And when you tell yourself the truth, you understand that many limits you thought were external were actually internal walls you constructed. And this realization can feel overwhelming because it shifts responsibility fully back onto you, removing the illusion of blame you've relied on. But in this discomfort lies liberation, because if you built those walls, you also hold the power to dismantle them piece by piece. And honesty becomes the bridge between who you are and who you're capable of becoming, closing the gap you once thought was permanent. And it teaches you that growth doesn't come from pretending you're fine, but from confronting the exact reasons you aren't. And it pushes you to evaluate the standards you've tolerated and ask whether they reflect your true worth or your past insecurities. And self-honesty demands accountability, not punishment, inviting you to take ownership of your future instead of repeating old patterns. And once you accept that truth, the excuses that once felt comforting start to feel heavy and impossible to carry any longer. And the power of self-honesty lies in its ability to create internal clarity, the kind that cuts through confusion and reveals what must change. And it forces you to see the cost of holding on to things that drain you, and that cost is always higher than the comfort they provide. And you begin to notice how staying attached to outdated habits and relationships keeps you anchored to moments you should have already outgrown. And this clarity pulls you toward the person you want to be, even when the path requires sacrifice, discomfort, or letting go of familiarity. And it shows you how much energy you've wasted managing situations that weren't aligned with your values or your future direction. And with clarity, you stop negotiating with your potential and start honoring it through actions that challenge your old limitations. And you realize that honesty isn't about judgment. It's about recognizing where you're misaligned and choosing something better intentionally. And this shift opens space in your mind and life, space that was once crowded with obligations, expectations, and emotional weight. And clarity transforms into momentum, because when you stop lying to yourself, your decisions finally match your goals. And that alignment becomes the beginning of true freedom, grounded not in fantasy, but in the truth you worked hard to face. And radical honesty also demands that you evaluate the motives behind your choices, questioning whether they come from fear or genuine desire. And when you operate from fear, you cling tightly to the known, even if the known is slowly suffocating your growth. But when you operate from desire, you begin choosing the experiences that challenge you, shape you, and elevate your sense of self. And honesty reveals the gap between the life you're living and the life you keep imagining when nobody else is watching. And it urges you to confront why that gap exists and what patterns continue to widen it despite your intentions. And you start recognizing when you're sabotaging opportunities because they threaten the comfort of your old identity. And this awareness becomes a turning point because you can't unsee the ways you've been getting in your own way. And with each truth you accept, your tolerance for low standards, empty commitments, and draining environments begins to shrink. And you become more protective of your time and energy because you finally understand their value in shaping your future. And in that protection, you realize that leaving what no longer serves you is not an act of abandonment, but an act of self-respect. And self-honesty ultimately transforms your inner narrative, replacing the stories built on insecurity and doubt with ones grounded in responsibility and possibility. And it teaches you that growth doesn't require perfection. It requires the willingness to see yourself clearly and act accordingly. And this willingness fuels a deeper confidence because it's built on truth, not on external validation or temporary motivation. And you become more intentional with your choices, letting go of what drains you and embracing what challenges you to rise higher. And honesty helps you see that every environment you stay in shapes you, and not all environments deserve access to your future. And you begin choosing relationships that support your evolution rather than reinforce your past, shifting your circle with purpose. And you replace comfort-driven habits with growth-driven ones because you finally understand discipline as a form of self-love, and your internal dialogue becomes more empowering, not because life gets easier, but because your clarity makes uncertainty less frightening. And every decision becomes a reflection of your true values, not the expectations that once dictated your identity. And through that alignment, you reclaim the power to build a life that matches the truth you were brave enough to face. Letting go isn't about losing something. It's about releasing the version of you that was built for a chapter you've already outgrown. And you start to realize that many of the things you hold onto, habits, relationships, jobs, routines, were never meant to support your next level. And they were stepping stones, not destinations, and holding onto them only keeps you anchored to a smaller identity. And when you finally loosen your grip, you create space for a new identity to emerge, one that aligns with your ambitions instead of your fears. And this transformation feels uncomfortable because you're shedding the familiar, even when the familiar is limiting. But letting go is the price you pay for expansion, a necessary trade between who you were and who you're becoming. And it forces you to stop romanticizing the past and start taking responsibility for your future. And you begin to recognize that evolution requires subtraction just as much as addition. And in that subtraction, you uncover strengths, desires, and capacities that were buried beneath old versions of yourself. And letting go becomes the ultimate upgrade, not because it's easy, but because it forces you to rise into a fuller expression of who you are. And identity evolves every time you choose growth over comfort, every time you stop reacting from old patterns and start responding from your potential. And this shift doesn't happen overnight. It happens in small, deliberate decisions that reshape how you see yourself. And you begin to understand that identity isn't fixed. It's a living thing that grows with every challenge you face. But when you cling to outdated attachments, you freeze your identity in a chapter that no longer reflects your capabilities. And the danger isn't in letting go. The danger is in staying loyal to versions of yourself that limit your progress. And old identities are seductive because they feel safe, predictable, and familiar, even when they're quietly suffocating your dreams. And letting go breaks that illusion, revealing just how much potential was locked behind the fear of change. And you stop asking, who have I been? And start asking, who do I want to become? And this question becomes your compass, guiding you toward choices that align with your evolved identity. And slowly, you realize that becoming your future self requires divorcing your loyalty to your past self. And as your identity shifts, so do the environments and relationships that surround you, because not everything can grow with you. And some people are connected to the older version of you, the less confident you, the smaller you, the you who settled more than you should have. And when you rise, these connections naturally loosen, not because you're better than them, but because you're becoming different. And it's normal to feel guilty when outgrowing people, habits, and dynamics that once felt essential. But growth isn't personal, it's directional, and not everyone is meant to match that direction. And your future identity demands alignment, and alignment requires recognizing which relationships nourish your evolution and which ones drain it. And the more you step into your new identity, the clearer it becomes which environments are supportive and which are restrictive. And some people will celebrate your growth. Others will resist it because your evolution exposes their stagnation. And letting go becomes easier when you understand that making space for your future sometimes means releasing what anchors you to your past. And through this process, you learn that every goodbye creates room for relationships that better match who you're becoming. And letting go also requires redefining your internal beliefs, especially the ones that tell you what you're capable of. And your old identity is built on stories about your limits, your worth, your abilities, that once protected you but now hold you back. And upgrading your identity means questioning these narratives and challenging the emotional comfort they provide. And this mental rewriting isn't easy because your brain is wired to prefer the predictable, even when the predictable is painful. And you start noticing how many of your decisions were made from fear, self-doubt, or a desire to avoid discomfort. But when you're committed to upgrading your identity, you begin choosing from possibility instead of fear. And every brave decision strengthens the new version of you, reinforcing beliefs that support your growth instead of restricting it. And you start celebrating progress instead of perfection, because growth becomes more meaningful than maintaining your image. And your internal dialogue shifts from hesitation to conviction, from shrinking to expanding. And this mindset shift becomes the foundation of your new identity, one that moves you forward with clarity rather than insecurity. And letting go is ultimately an act of self-trust, a declaration that you believe in the person you're becoming more than the person you've been. And it's choosing to invest in your future self, even when the path isn't fully clear, trusting that you'll figure it out along the way. And you begin to understand that growth is rarely comfortable, but it's always worth the uncertainty it brings. And the more you release what no longer serves you, the lighter you feel, emotionally, mentally, and even physically. And your decision-making becomes sharper because you stop making choices from guilt or nostalgia, and you make them from alignment, direction, and a deep sense of responsibility for your own evolution. And letting go teaches you that you don't need to force everything to stay. What is meant for the next version of you will naturally fit. And what no longer fits will fall away, not because you failed, but because you evolved. And you step into a life that mirrors your courage instead of your fears, your growth instead of your hesitation. And in every step forward reinforces the truth that leaving what no longer serves you is the most powerful form of self-upgrading you'll ever do. Discomfort is the unmistakable signal that you're stepping beyond the limits of who you used to be and into the territory of who you're meant to become. And it shows up the moment you stop choosing the easy path and start making decisions that challenge your patterns and routines. And this discomfort isn't punishment. It's proof that you're interrupting cycles you've lived in for years without questioning. And every time you feel resistance, it's a sign that you're breaking away from the habits and mindsets that kept you small. And growth is supposed to feel unfamiliar because you're learning to operate from a version of yourself you haven't fully met yet. And you start realizing that comfort has never created transformation, only repetition of the same results. And discomfort, on the other hand, acts like a compass pointing toward the areas where you're meant to evolve. And it forces you to confront the tendencies that sabotage your progress and the fears that shape your decisions. And you discover that avoiding discomfort keeps you aligned with your past, while embracing it pulls you into your potential. And in that realization, discomfort becomes less of an enemy and more of a necessary collaborator in your growth. And when you're stepping into something bigger, discomfort becomes the bridge between intention and transformation. And it tests whether you want the change you talk about as much as you claim to, separating desire from commitment. And you learn that motivation might get you started, but discomfort is what shapes your discipline and consistency. And every uncomfortable moment is an invitation to practice becoming the person you say you want to be. And that's why discomfort is so valuable. It reveals your real limits, not the imagined ones you've believed for years. And it exposes the parts of your identity that are outdated and incapable of carrying you into your next level. And in that exposure, you gain clarity about the habits, people, and beliefs that no longer align with your direction. And you become more intentional because you stop avoiding the discomfort of truth and start using it as fuel. And even when progress feels slow or uncertain, discomfort reminds you that growth is happening beneath the surface. And the more you allow yourself to sit with that discomfort, the stronger and more self-assured you become. And discomfort becomes especially powerful when you recognize it as the cost of entering a new chapter. And it's the price you pay to build resilience instead of relying on the temporary security that comfort provides. And when you choose discomfort, you're choosing evolution, because you're training your mind to operate at a higher level. And you learn to separate discomfort from danger, understanding that not everything unfamiliar is a threat to your well-being. And in fact, most of the things you fear are simply things you haven't yet experienced, understood, or mastered. And this shift frees you from the limitations of your past self, who avoided challenge to protect a fragile comfort zone. And you begin to see discomfort as a teacher, guiding you toward the skills and strength required for your next identity. And every difficult conversation, challenging task, or unfamiliar opportunity becomes a stepping stone instead of an obstacle. And you stop shrinking when things feel hard and instead lean in, knowing that this is exactly where growth happens. And as you build this habit, discomfort transforms from something you fear into something you expect and embrace. And when you allow discomfort to be part of your journey, you develop a deeper level of emotional and mental endurance. And you stop reacting impulsively to challenge and start responding with clarity, intention, and controlled effort. And this endurance becomes the foundation of your confidence because it's rooted in evidence. You've survived hard things before. And you also stop needing life to be easy in order to feel capable, because your capability now comes from your resilience. And that resilience shows you that you can handle uncertainty, pressure, and change without falling apart. And you become less dependent on external validation because you've learned to build internal strength through consistent challenge. And discomfort becomes the pathway to discovering parts of yourself you didn't know existed, strengths, skills, and courage you never used before. And you begin trusting yourself on a deeper level because you see how often you rise when you could have retreated. And this trust becomes a silent but powerful advantage, guiding you through the unknown without losing your sense of direction. And with each step, you realize that discomfort hasn't been breaking you. It's been shaping you. And discomfort ultimately transforms your relationship with growth, shifting it from something intimidating into something purposeful. And you stop associating fear with failure and start seeing it as a doorway into the next version of yourself. And instead of avoiding challenges, you begin pursuing them because you understand they hold the keys to your evolution. And you make decisions based on where you want to be rather than where you feel safe, allowing ambition to guide your choices. And this mindset shift changes the energy of your entire life, pushing you into opportunities you once believed were unreachable. And you no longer wait for the perfect moment because you recognize that perfect moments rarely exist, only committed action does. And you stop tolerating environments that demand you stay small just to remain comfortable. And your standard rises because discomfort taught you what you're capable of when you push beyond your limits, and you begin to step into a life built on intention, courage, and truth rather than convenience and avoidance. And every step forward reinforces that embracing discomfort is the clearest proof that you're finally growing into who you were meant to be. Protecting your energy begins with understanding that it is not unlimited, and every choice you make either multiplies it or drains it. And you start noticing how much of your mental space is consumed by obligations that don't align with your goals or your values. And energy is a currency, and when you spend it on things that are beneath your standards, you rob your future self of growth. And this awareness forces you to evaluate who and what has access to you, because access is a privilege, not a default. And you become more selective with your time, not because you're selfish, but because you're finally intentional. And the more you protect your energy, the clearer your thinking becomes, and clarity leads to better decisions. And you begin walking away from distractions not out of bitterness, but out of self-respect. And you understand that every yes has a cost, and saying yes to everything leaves nothing for what actually matters. And protecting your energy becomes less about closing doors and more about opening the right ones. And in this shift, you feel a power you've never experienced before, a power rooted in focus, boundaries, and alignment. And guarding your energy requires learning the difference between what feels good in the moment and what supports you in the long run. And you start recognizing the environments that drain your motivation, the conversations that keep you stuck, and the patterns that waste your potential. And instead of chasing instant comfort, you begin choosing long-term alignment, even when it requires discipline. And this choice strengthens your sense of identity because it reminds you that you are responsible for your own momentum. And you understand that not everyone is meant to grow with you. And protecting your energy sometimes means releasing people you care about. And it's not about judging them. It's about recognizing that different seasons require different circles. And when someone consistently pulls you into negativity, chaos, or stagnation, you stop making excuses for their impact. And you learn to love people without allowing them to interrupt your progress or drain your emotional bandwidth. And energy protection becomes an act of maturity, not emotional coldness. And with every boundary you uphold, you reinforce your commitment to your future self. And protecting your energy also means mastering the art of saying no without guilt or apology. And you stop over-explaining, over-committing, and over-sacrificing just to avoid disappointing others. And you realize that every time you compromise your own needs to please someone else, you're teaching them to expect less of you. And saying no becomes an act of clarity, a way of prioritizing what actually supports your growth. And you discover that the people who truly respect you will never resent your boundaries. They will honor them. And boundaries stop feeling like walls and start feeling like guidance systems that direct your energy toward the right things. And you stop tying your worth to how much you can give and start tying it to how intentionally you live. And your no becomes a filter that protects your purpose from unnecessary noise. And with each no, your yes becomes more powerful, more aligned, and more meaningful. And in this way, boundaries become the invisible structure that protects your mental, emotional, and spiritual energy. And the more you protect your energy, the more you notice how your environment influences your level of ambition, focus, and clarity. And you start gravitating toward people who think bigger, expect more, and live with intention. And their presence elevates your mindset because they embody the standards you're building within yourself. And you feel more inspired, more grounded, and more motivated because your energy is no longer being drained by the wrong influences. And you begin choosing conversations that expand you rather than ones that distract you. And you select goals that challenge you rather than ones that simply maintain the status quo. And your environment becomes a reflection of your priorities, not your fears. And you stop shrinking to fit spaces that don't value your growth. And instead, you seek out spaces that demand your evolution, because that's where your energy thrives the most. And this shift becomes the difference between surviving your days and building a life that excites you. And protecting your energy is ultimately about choosing intentional alignment over emotional attachment, and choosing your future over your comfort. And when you prioritize your energy, you start moving with a level of focus and confidence that changes how you see yourself. And you no longer tolerate chaos disguised as loyalty or distraction disguised as opportunity. And you stop apologizing for outgrowing things that were never meant for the next version of you. And you understand that you are responsible for the standards you accept and the environments you participate in. And this kind of protection isn't selfish. It's strategic, empowering, and necessary for long-term growth. And the more you honor your energy, the more life begins aligning with your vision instead of pulling you backward. And you start attracting people, opportunities, and experiences that match the strength of your boundaries. And you realize that protecting your energy doesn't limit your life, it elevates it. And in choosing that elevation, you step into a future built on clarity, power, alignment, and a deep respect for the person you are becoming.